Hello, my name is Ana Wall. I'm the Chief Curator of the Pensacola Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us online on this Friday afternoon. We are honored to be presenting today's program in conjunction with our exhibition, The Kingdom of This World Reimagined. This virtual panel is the second in a two-part programming series supported by the Florida Humanities Council. We would like to acknowledge their support and their continued important work promoting the humanities across our state. Today's panel is moderated by Leslie A. Wolfe, the curator and organizer of The Kingdom of This World Reimagined. Leslie is assistant professor in art history at Texas Tech University, specializing in Latinx and Latin American art and critical theory. In addition to her research and publications on the visual cultures of the Americas, and her forthcoming book on food and art in modern Mexico, she is also a curator who has worked with various institutions across the US, including the Norton Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, and the Little Haiti Cultural Center. I want to extend our gratitude to Leslie, her co-organizer, Edouard Duval-Carrier, today's panelists, and all of the artists that came together to bring this exhibition to life. Please join me in welcoming Leslie and our esteemed panelists to the screen.
Thank you so much, Ana. I really want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And I want to especially thank Chief Curator Ana Wall and Director Nick Krogan and Curator of Education Caitlin Cooney and the entire Pensacola Museum of Art staff for bringing this exhibition to life anew. I also want to thank the Florida Humanities Council for sponsoring today's program. And my biggest thanks go to the artists who have so generously contributed to this exhibition, especially Edouard Duval-Carrier and the Haitian Cultural Arts Alliance, who were vital to the organization and development of this project. Just a quick note about the program. You are encouraged to type any questions that you have for the panelists into the Q&A function at any point during the conversation. After I introduce the panelists in a moment, and we'll hear some brief remarks from them about the art in the exhibition, we'll have a conversation. We will then open it up at the end to your questions and comments from the audience. So I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully, yes, all right. So to begin, I would like to briefly introduce the exhibition, The Kingdom of This World Reimagined, which first opened in 2019. Oh, excuse me. Hold on one moment. Let's share. It didn't happen well. Okay, let me try that one more time. Okay. Let's start that over. So to begin, I would like to briefly introduce the exhibition, The Kingdom of This World Reimagined, which first opened in 2019 on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the publication of the book, The Kingdom of This World, a fictionalized retelling of the events surrounding the Haitian Revolution of the 19th century, originally authored by Alejo Carpentier in 1949. Carpentier, a Swiss-born Cuban writer, traveled to northern Haiti, the setting of his book, in 1943, and conducted rigorous archival research on the era of the Haitian Revolution, ultimately transforming those historical events into a fantastical narrative that is popularly characterized, and in Carpentier's own words, as lo real maravilloso, or the marvelous real, what we call in the US magical realism. For this exhibition of contemporary art of and about the Caribbean and its diasporas, Carpentier's famous book served as a prompt that elicited new work responding to Carpentier's hyper-stylized vision of the revolution. Each of the 11 contributing artists addressed the visual and socio-political tensions between this exceptional history and perceptions or images we conjure when evoking the Caribbean and Haiti more specifically in the present day. These artworks engage myriad notions, such as the historical legacies of Haitian heroes like Francois Macandal, the enslaved resistance against the plantocracy, particularly through marronage practices in communities, and the role of Vodou and Afro-diasporic spirituality as a liberatory vehicle that helped bring about not only a free Black nation, but the very first nation in the world to formally abolish enslavement. These artists bring to the surface the complexities of this heritage that has long been erased or veiled from Western memory. While stylistically distinct, therefore, all of these artworks share in a visual dialogue about what we might term the afterlife of slavery, to cite Saidiya Hartman. These afterlives, like a latent photographic image, shift our sense of time from a linear evolution to a persistent ebbing and flowing of tides that force past and present to endlessly converge. In this way, like Alejo Carpentier's narrative, these artists' fantastical compositions are no less truthful than the events that inspire them. They are rather lenses that refract reality in infinitely complex directions from multiple vantage points that are too often obscured from our visual field. This year has seen Haiti and Haitians foregrounded in the media due to a series of catastrophic events, from the president's assassination, the devastating earthquake in the south of the country, tropical storm flooding, and of course, the deportations of Haitian migrants at the southern US border. With this contemporary context in mind, I would today like to invite a conversation that steps back from popular images of horror and devastation that have become so prevalent in our media landscape. And instead, I wish to enter into a conversation with our esteemed panelists about Haitian heritage and its place in a broader Caribbean and indeed global history. And perhaps most pressingly, I want to invite an interrogation of these phenomena in relation to representation, literary, visual, and otherwise, past and present, by honoring and attending to the brilliant subtlety, nuance, and critical vision that each of the artists in this exhibition has brought to their work. So with that, I would like to now introduce each of our four brilliant panelists whose expertise resides in the areas of history, visual culture, literature, and art, all discourses that I think these artworks demand be brought together as we're doing today. So I'll begin with Dr. Marlena Dout, who's professor of African American and African Studies, American Studies at the University of Virginia. She is the author of Baron de Vestie and the Origins of Black Atlantic Humanism from 2017, and Tropics of Haiti, Race and the Literary History of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic World, 1789 to 1865 from 2015. She is also co-editor of the volume Haitian Revolutionary Fictions, an Anthology from 2021. And her next book is an intellectual history of Haiti titled Awakening the Ashes, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Ana Dopico is director of the Hemispheric Institute at NYU, where she is associate professor of comparative literature and Spanish and Portuguese. She teaches comparative studies of Cuba, the Americas, and the Global South. She has published work on Cuban and Cuban American imaginaries, comparatism and intellectual history, Latin American visual art, race and political memory, and Cuban cultural history. She is completing a book on Cuban cultural history titled Cubanologies, Altered States of the Nation. Professor Dopico is also author of the blog and book project Cuba Cargo/Cult, whose essays reflect the period from December 17, 2014 through the death of Fidel Castro. She is presently researching a new book project about Miami entitled Cold Civil Wars, Race Politics in Black and Cuban Miami, 1960 to 1980. Dr. Jerry Filigean is associate professor in the American Studies Department at Dickinson College. Her research and teaching explore the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, and gender in contemporary visual arts, interdisciplinary American cultural and art history, Caribbean art history and visual arts with an emphasis on the Francophone Caribbean, Black cultural politics, and theories of the African diaspora. Her work has appeared in myriad publications, including Small Axe, Bomb Magazine, Contemporary French and Francophone Studies, Radical History Review, and Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago, among others. Her awards include an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for The Socially Dead and Improbable Citizen, Theorizing Visual Transformations of Haitian Citizenship from 2020, the Elsa Mellon Bruce Visiting Senior Fellowship at the National Gallery of Art, the Center for Advanced Studies of the Visual Arts in 2019, and a Humanities Writ Large Visiting Faculty Fellowship at Duke University in 2017 and 2018. And Dr. Erin Stone is Associate Professor in History and Director of Early American Studies at the University of West Florida in Pensacola, Florida. She received her PhD from Vanderbilt University in 2014 in Atlantic and Latin American history, studying under Dr. Jane Landers. Her research explores early interactions between Spanish conquistadors and the indigenous residents of the Circum-Caribbean. This past spring, she published her first book, Captives of Conquest: Slavery in the Early Modern Spanish Caribbean, that focuses on the rise and impact of the earliest indigenous slave trade. In addition to her monograph, Stone has published her research in several articles, including Slave Raiders versus Friars in Tierra Firme, 1513 to 1522 in the Americas in 2017, and The Conquest of Española as a Structure of Conjuncture in Ethnohistory in 2021. I would like to welcome each of the panelists who have so generously responded to my prompt to not only be here today in conversation, but specifically to select an artwork or grouping of artworks from the exhibition and to provide some initial remarks on that work from their scholarly perspective. So I'm going to turn the camera, as it were, over to each of them individually now, and we'll begin with remarks from Dr. Marlena Dout.
There we go. Hello, I hope you can hear me. So thank you so much. I want to first thank Leslie and Anna for this beautiful exhibit. I wish that I could see it in person. It is amazing. I am going to be talking about what you're looking at on the screen, which are the Edouard Duval-Carrier etchings from his The Kingdom of This World series. And so I'm gonna circle back around to the image of Macandal, but I actually wanna start in indigenous Haiti with Cacique Henri. I read the first image in the sequence, so the farthest on the top on the left, that one, yes, The Kingdom of Haiti Reimagined, as this melding, if you can see it closely at the top there, this melding of the history of Henri Christophe, King of Haiti, with his namesake from indigenous Haiti, Enrique, sometimes called Enriquillo, and the Haitians called him Henri with an I. So I'll start a little bit with Macandal and merging them together. So the primary people in the colony, of course, who suffered from the violence of slavery were always the enslaved Black people in the period of time that Carpentier is writing about. True to the form of relation, however, with indigenous Haiti, there's a conjuncture between the enslavement experienced by the indigenous population of the island, and which is what Enrique or Henry was fleeing from, and the slavery experienced by enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported to the island. And so a different Haitian author, a 19th century Haitian author named Erard Dumel, in his Voyage dans le Nord d'Haïti from 1824, always seems to me to be the precursor to kind of the critical fabulation or magical realism that Alejo Carpentier is putting into effect with The Kingdom of This World, because Dumel also merged the history of slavery with the indigenous history of the island, with the ceremony of Bois Caïman, with the history of Macandal. He said that the Haitian Revolution would have exploded much earlier, in fact, if Macandal had not been executed by French authorities. These are Dumel's words. Such was the project formed in the 16th and 17th centuries by the successors of the Aborigines in several colonies of the American archipelago. So he makes the connection between Enrique's rebellion, which led to the first Maroon Treaty in all of the Americas, and the later rebellion of Macandal in the 1750s. He said that Macandal's rebellion would have enveloped every organism on this island. If Macandal, its restorer, a man otherwise endowed with a rare intelligence and with that character of energy that tyranny labors to destroy, by making it seem odious, if I may say so, had not been arrested in the course of his design, and if the circumstances in which his conspiracy were revealed had not subjected him to the fate of an obscure conspirator. Makan Dout, that resonant name whose evocation for so long after his death became the sign, symbol, and rhythm of rebellion in the Caribbean, it's also a dance, was a fugitive from slavery, a maroon who had been allegedly using poison, as well as a vast network of formerly enslaved people who had liberated themselves as early as the 1750s. Upon his condemnation in January 1758, Makan Dout was subjected to what is called the amende honorable. According to the official account recorded by officials from the Conseil Supérieur du Cap Français, principal city, the capital of the colony, Makan Dout was accused of, quote, having corrupted and seduced other enslaved individuals with des paquets prétendus magiques, or supposedly magical packets that he sold with, quote unquote, malicious intent. The Makan Dout sentencing read that he had sold, composed, and distributed poisons of all kinds using sacred materials. For this, Makan Dout was condemned to make the amende honorable, naked, en chemise, holding a torch of hot wax of 2 pounds in his hands before the main door of the parish church of this city. The executor of high justice was to transport Makan Dout to the spot of his execution with a sign that read, suborner, profaner, poisoner. Like Auger and Chavannes later, Makan Dout was to admit to all of the above, that's the amende honorable, and to ask for pardon from God, the king, and justice. After this, he was supposed to be burned alive while attached to a stake in the public square in Cap Français. This is where the similitude between the execution of Makan Dout and the later execution of Auger and Chavannes diverges. According to an anonymous planter writing from Cap Français in a letter dated just a few months, 6 months after the execution, Makan Dout had been a maroon for 18 years after having previously been enslaved by a planter in Lambay. During those 18 years of fugitivity, Makan Dout was engaged in the selling of poisons, but according to this man, they were to kill the enslaved people. And the number of people he caused to die during those 18 years is, quote, incalculable. Having been condemned to his death on January 20th, the anonymous author records that Makan Dout made such prodigious efforts to avoid the punishment that the neck chain and the shackles became detached from the poteau, such that he saved himself from the fire, his body having been partially burned. The enslaved population, who observed firsthand this white colonial ritual of capital punishment, said Makan Dout had succeeded in escaping execution by flying away. The anonymous letter writer tells us that the maréchaussée, who are the sort of fugitive slave hunting soldiers, and the planters were careful to have the Negroes surrounding the square taken away from the scene as soon as possible. All those unfortunate people on leaving shouted aloud that Francois Makan Dout was a sorcerer and incombustible, that he was right to tell them that no one could stop him, and that as soon as we got a hold of him, he would turn into a mosquito. So this is the metamorphosis that you are seeing in the image. So extraordinary was the suggestion, vision even, that the executioner himself could not believe what he was seeing. As the story was passed down from generation to generation in Saint-Domingue and then in Haiti, it took on its own life. Some tellers of the story insisted that Makan Dout really did flee as a mosquito, as alleged by the anonymous writer. Makan Dout himself had purportedly claimed during his interrogation that if he was ever captured by the white colonists, he would escape by taking on multiple different life forms. Others recalled that he transformed himself into a fly. Because of the general chaos that ensued when Makan Dout leapt out of the fire, however, scattering the audience in multiple different directions, there were few witnesses to the actual execution. This ambiguity and lack of personal testimony from any perspective other than that of his executioners has lent even more credence to the idea that no one really knows what happened to one of Saint-Domingue's most famous maroon leaders. And so this is why I think these images from Duval-Carrier are so wonderful and beautiful, because like the novel from which they are sort of inspired, or by which they were inspired, I see this as putting into effect what Saidiya Hartman has called critical fabulation, which she says the intention isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. And I love that she said paint there, because I think it opens the door for different kinds of critical fabulation. This double gesture, she says, can be described as straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time, enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of the captives precisely through the process of narration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marlena. That was an extraordinary entry into our conversation, and I'm sure we'll circle back to critical fabulations and bring that into the conversation. I would now like to welcome Dr. Ana Dopico to speak to a work by José Bedia.
So the work that José Bedia has contributed, Royaume le Monde, The Kingdom of this World 2021, is a mixed media on a mate paper with a chair, a whip, and a paquet Congo. I'm going to address some of those elements, particularly the main work. But I want to talk for a moment about the text and the context of Haiti as an origin for the Cuban imagination. The book itself, El Reino de este Mundo, was published in 1949, and its preface included an essay, a short essay, as Leslie has told us, that was a sort of manifesto for what Carpentier wanted to call for among Latin American artists, for the marvelous real, something that was capable of competing with surrealism in being able to tell the story of the hemisphere. And for him, Haiti was an embodiment of the marvelous real because it was grounded in a spiritual basis for liberation. However, my thinking and my reflection on Carpentier's ambition is not only that he wanted a new technique, but that he wanted something that could compete with something that was already telling the story of Black liberation, namely writers in the Negritude movement, or writers like Aimé Césaire, whose Notebook of a Return to the Native Land was published in 1939, or the Haitian novelist Jacques Romain, whose Masters of the Dew was published 5 years before El Reino de este Mundo. And I want to recenter that because El Reino de este Mundo is read as a sort of masterpiece from a master writer. And we need to rethink it and to think the way that Blackness becomes an origin, not only for Cuban nationalism, but for ethnography and literature, and the way that Carpentier, alongside the kind of inventor of ethnography, Fernando Ortiz, use Black life and Black liberation, elevate it, write about it, turn it into part of their life's work, even as Black Cubans were being marginalized politically. In the ethnographic channeling, or some might say ventriloquism, of writing about Blackness, about Santeria, about a Black underclass. And then in the masterworks of writers who take Black life in Cuba and systematize it, Blackness and Black liberation become somehow safe, an object of empirical knowledge. It becomes abstracted, familiar, distanced, somehow acceptable for the imaginaries of white Cubans, for whom Cuban nationalism and Cubanidad is articulated as something that's not racist, that's mixed race. So I want us to think about the displacement of the Haitian Revolution and of Haiti as origin. I find it remarkable that people sort of reflect on Masters of the Dew with frequency, but not necessarily in relation to El Reino de este Mundo. And it's remarkable for us to remember it now because Masters of the Dew is a novel that was published in 1944, but was set during the US occupation of Haiti, which lasted from 1915 to 1934. That in itself is something that I think we need to think about with relation to the continuum of the present. So I would say that the ambition of Carpentier's novel and his desire for a marvelous real technique is both a tribute to the memory of the Haitian Revolution and an aspiration to compete not only with European surrealism, but with Black avant-gardes and political literature like Roman's novel, which is a realist novel, coming from Black writers in the Caribbean and in a global diaspora. I want us to think through those categories and to think about the ethnographic, the transcultural. José Bedia's work, as you see, is not immediately legible to us. Bedia is an artist who's been long immersed. He's a Cuban artist, a white Cuban artist, but with a deep investment and a long immersion in Palomonte Mayombe, which is a Congo-based syncretic faith closely related to Voodoo, right, to Voodoo, which is a kind of Cuban version. His relation to Haitian sacred art and to artists like Wilfredo Lam in the figure of the horned figure are evident to anyone who follows those imaginaries. But if we encounter it in a sort of innocence, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty compelling, and it's slightly illegible. You have to work hard to approach this work. Bedia's marking of the novel in his world, in his world of image, can be read, or we have to think of it as challenging. He invokes the symbology and visual order of Voodoo. To the left, you see the potomitan, which is a kind of central post, a central element of Haitian spiritual celebration, right? It's the center of the peristyle, which is the design that is at the center of the large figure, the large horned figure. He summons the elements of the narrative which deliver the sort of logic, the spiritual logic, which moves revolution, right? And he inscribes it in such a way that we have to really look at every element, at every inscription, not only to find words that we then have to translate if we don't speak Creole, right? But elements and drawings that we have to work very hard to understand. And I think this is important because in that sense, then the novel, the story, and Haiti resist transparency, right? They are delivered as something slightly challenging and opaque, as a deep sort of density, right? And the semiotics of liberation, those sign systems that deliver the liberation within the novel, are very carefully laid out in the work. If you could look very closely, the image above and to the left, you would see the words that mean, I don't know if you can see, right? See the signs from heaven, right? And a kind of the symbol exactly is, and Bedia uses these profiles and these sketched figures constantly throughout his work. The horned figure is often a figure of humanity or faith, and here it's the personification, the central personification of Macandal, right? If you looked all the way to the right, where a skull and crossbones is drawn, you see mutilation, right? The mutilated arm that's been lost. If you look to the left at the potomitan, what you find is not the burning, like the smaller element of the smaller drawing shows you the burning of Macandal, but in fact, what his co-conspirators seeking liberation experienced instead, right? The descent of the gods down that main post, right? that then makes possible his transformation, his metamorphosis, and his liberation from burning and punishment into a spirit of freedom, right? Because Macandal becomes a lizard, he becomes a butterfly, he becomes a dog, right? He is capable of moving through the life world of humans, which aims to extinguish him. And across, as you look at Bedia's work, you're encountering a challenge, right? You might find some things you recognize. You have to work in French and Creole. You have to enter the sign systems of the novel once again, but they're no longer Carpentier's discursive story. They're the imagistic logic, the sign systems of Vodou are restored to something mysterious, something that's still sort of contingent, something that you have to make sense of. And I find that deeply powerful. I don't want to go too much further here, but I want to point out something that many of us here might recognize, which is, while we are used to the Caribbean and Haiti in particular being transparent to us, right, in these imaginaries of catastrophe and rescue or oppression, in fact, Haitian artists have been working through their own aesthetics. And while Carpentier and the artists that then take on this afterlife, right, these radical reimaginings of Black liberation in Haiti, it's important to think of the idea that Haiti is opaque, right? The idea that the writing of Haiti can summon something that Edouard Glissant has called opacity. And opacity blocks you from reading me as a transparent object, right? In opacity, you encounter who I am within my sign system, right? You can enter my community, but you have to understand some of what that means. And I find that thinking with works that create opacity and tension and make you work to understand your distance from a whole universe of sense, right, that exists in Haiti and Haitian art is a good countermeasure, right, a good counter politics to the way that empire and whiteness make Haiti transparent, accessible and consumable, and equally can make Haiti something that we can set aside and forget. So I'll stop there. I have a lot of other things to say, but I can't wait to hear the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Ana. That was so fascinating, and yeah, you've given us a lot to circle back to. So I really appreciate that. And now we will turn to Jerry Filigean, and Dr. Filigean is going to talk to us about 3 works that are by the artist Sherazad Garcia.
Sorry, I was muted. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Leslie, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel, and congratulations on this amazing exhibition. So I look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to keep my my comments brief, but hopefully we'll be able to have some Q&A and definitely some larger discussions at the end of the presentations. And I'm really excited and really happy that Professors Dout and Dopico opened up with thinking about the possibility and the necessity to reevaluate Carpentier's work in relationship to some of the larger other intellectual movements and issues that were going on during the time. And I find it very, I particularly find it very fascinating that he, goes to Haiti in 43 and he is kind of thinking about this, thinking about Haiti and thinking about the revolution and thinking about ways in which to articulate that. And a few months later, Suzanne Césaire is also in Haiti with Aimé Césaire, and there also, she, in particular, she's also rethinking and I'm trying to understand, get a sense of, negritude, surrealism, and Black modernism. So I think the fact that Haiti becomes this space where they are having this conversation, reimagining, rethinking what the Caribbean, the larger Caribbean might look like, and what images of freedom might look like, and what conversations of revolution might look like. And Haiti becomes this space for that. So I'm really interested in the ways in which these two writers, these two thinkers of Caribbean freedom are trying to imagine in different ways. So, and this is something that also excites me about Scheherazade Garcia's work, because those are, I think, the conversations that Carpentier and Césaire are having in print, she's having visually. She's actually articulating visually. So I want to just kind of briefly mention a few points about these this triptych that we're looking at, and kind of think about a few things that I see in her work that are happening, and I'd like to further talk about them as we, of course, open up the discussion. So what I find fascinating about Garcia's work, in particular this piece, is something that one of your questions, Leslie, that you sent around to us, is this idea of revisiting historical knowledge and reimagining future possibilities. And I think it is in that kind of reimagining historical narratives and at the same time concealing them is what makes Garcia's work so powerful and so visually appealing and enticing. And we see this in particular, I'm thinking of the middle triptych, which is Caribbean Dreams, I believe. The one in the middle, yes, thank you, that one. And what I love about this particular piece is the use, the tonality of the skin of the female figure. In that tonality, in the browns of the female figure, we can actually kind of think about the idea of representation, and we can think about and try to come to terms with or understand the ways in which traditional representations challenge how we understand ideas of beauty, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. So Scheherazade is really wanting us, I believe, in this piece to kind of rethink the image of the female, the image of the female. But she also wants us to think about the idea, to reimagine the idea of beauty, and doing that, the ways in which she kind of positions the model, positions the female figure in this image of portraiture, this full representational piece of portraiture. And I think that's a strategic element in her work, is that she places this brown female at the center of the narrative. So she, in a sense, becomes what we look at to think about ideas of beauty. So really disrupting and usurping, usurping how we think about ideas of 18th and 19th century beauty. So the second point I'd like to make about this particular piece is also what is hidden in the shadows. So if we go to what would be my left, we see two figures. Can you just kind of highlight the left? Yeah, exactly. These are two figures that Garcia has kind of hidden in the background, in the background of the image. And their images, they're both images of women dancing. So this is a carnival piece. This is a carnival piece. This individual is dressed for carnival, and we see that in the kind of feathery outfit that she has. So Scheherazade has kind of hidden in the background. So concealed but yet revealing these two individuals engage in a kind of Macandal, if you will, of Carnival. And the other kind of hidden character is on the right-hand side of the figure on the top by her face, another image who can read as perhaps a kind of imperial figure or another individual engaged in Carnival. So what her work does is at once presents to us this brown body engaged in her carnival outfit, but at the same time hidden in the back are these other figures, these other characters. So what her work asks us to do, it demands a different kind of looking. It demands a different kind of seeing, and it demands a particular kind of penetrating look that is one that I see very much in Carpenter's work, as well as in Césare's work. So I think that kind of asking us to look beyond the obvious is very, very important in Scheherazad's work. And we see that also in the other two pieces that kind of bookend this larger piece. And the last point I'll make about her work, and I think this is something that we see in the work of Caribbean artists, transnational artists who are really wanting to reimagine ideas of representation, ideas of art history in particular, is the kind of mixed media-ness, if that's even a word, the mixed media nature of her work, of bringing together a variety of different media to create a piece. You know, we know her work is drawing, painting, soft sculpture, multimedia, site-specific. The idea that she's bringing all of this in the visual sphere, in the visual framework, I think is a way to really break away from the traditional notions of creating art, really break away from the traditional notions of creating art, and allowing both aesthetics and conceptual ideas to kind of play in the playground of different ways of making art. And I think that Caribbean artists have, for a very, very long time, pushing the boundaries of what we imagine art making to be. And I would suggest also, I think Black and brown artists have been doing that for a long time too. So in that sense, I'm very interested in how her work serves, you know, her contemplation of aesthetics serve both as praxis and theory, and to help us kind of visualize the understanding and the idea of empowerment, freedom, and the idea to self-represent, even in moments of difficulties and of trauma, etc. So I'll stop it there, and then we can of course take this up during Q&A. So I just wanted to point out those three ideas as I've been thinking about her work and writing about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And you bring up something that I think about a lot, which is the art historical labor that these artists are enacting in their work. So now I'd like to turn to our fourth panelist, Dr. Erin Stone, who's going to speak to us about this triptych of works by artist Leah Gordon.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And again, thank you for organizing this really unique, especially for me, kind of event. So I approached, all of the exhibit, and I actually did get to see it. So I'm the only one who got to see it in person. But I approached it from, of course, the realm of history. So I think that my comments are probably going to be quite different from those of previous panelists. So this triptych really, really struck me because of how it tells the story in many ways of Haitian and Dominican, and really in many ways Caribbean history, from colonization to independence. The first work that struck me was the one to the left of the Black man. And what first struck me was the ship hat that he has, so the ship on his head. And this made me think of the Spanish conquest and then of the slave trade, and how this immediately kind of began the importation and subjugation first of Indians, of Tainos, and then Indians from all across the Spanish Americas, and then to later Africans. And this subjugation and slavery continued throughout the colonial period, and even in kind of a different way post-independence, when Haiti does gain freedom. I think you also see the limits of the Haitian Revolution in this image. So you have this Black man who has what looks like a soldier's uniform on the top, but then he has kind of like peasant farmer pants on the bottom, and he has a crutch. So perhaps this is because he's been injured, and even though Haiti gains their freedom, he still does not appear to be free or benefiting. And then you of course have the fortress. I thought that this was Sanssouci, the palace, immediately when I saw it, but it is the fortress behind him. It also kind of shows, this whole triptych shows the diversity of Haiti, of its history, of the Caribbean history. And I think that the image then on the right of the British soldier really drives this point home. And he is kind of the mirror image of the Black man. He still has the ship's hat. He still has this kind of soldier's uniform, but he also has the jeans, the drab bottom, and he seems to have the other crutch. And so to me, this kind of shows how the British came into the Haitian Revolution, how they involved themselves in that fight and actually tried to take Haiti. It also brings to mind a work by Vincent Brown, Reaper's Garden, which talks about death and disease in Jamaica, and how death and disease really kind of serve as a historical leveler. It doesn't matter your class, it doesn't matter your race. So many people died when they arrived in the Caribbean just because of the tropical climate and the disease. And so I kind of see that sort of showing here with like the paired British man and then the African, perhaps slave, perhaps peasant on the left. And then finally, I was struck by the central image because it really, to me, is really showing colonialism here. The white woman in the center, the older woman, appears to be completely leaning on the African woman and the indigenous woman, and they are supporting her. And to me, that just kind of is the perfect illustration of the old world of Europe, how they came and they sucked the lifeblood out of the Caribbean, of the indigenous people, the environment, and as well as the slaves that they then imported. I think it also really points out the overlap of indigenous and African slavery, which occurred especially in the 16th century, but moving on as well. And I was actually really struck by Marlena when you mentioned Enrique, because Cacique Enrique is actually the center of my dissertation and the book project, and his Maroon community that's located in the Baruco Mountains, which is now the divide between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The last thing about this image that kind of struck me was the whip. And it looks like a whip. I think it's a whip that is kind of uniting all of the female figures, but it's also covering up the sex organs of the African and indigenous woman. And to me, that just brought to mind sort of how slavery and how colonization really imposed gender norms and sexual norms of Europe and of Christianity onto the peoples of the Americas, and kind of definitely they were not only lost their autonomy through slavery, but also through the imposition of European culture through colonization. So I just found this to be absolutely fascinating, not only visually, but how I believe it really does show so many aspects of the history of Haiti and of the larger Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and I really look forward to engaging in some dialogue with you about your work in the contact era and how that can further our understanding of this kind of bigger historical history and trajectory of this artwork that we see here. So I see that we are getting on quite a bit in time. So it's 2:50, and I hope that you will all be willing to indulge us in allowing us to go over time a bit, so that we can continue our conversation. So I'll continue on. Hopefully we can have a conversation for about the next 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A if that's okay with everyone. So I would like to invite all of the panelists to turn your cameras back on and join us visually, as it were. And I mean, there's so much. My goodness, I wish that we had 5 hours to sit and discuss. But in the interest of time, I think there's a few starting points, and I welcome all of you to take these in whatever direction you'd like. But I was really struck by the way in which almost all of you, I think, were parsing out this the labor of critical looking, right? This sort of the different eye, as Jerry phrased it, that we need to bring to these artworks in order to understand them and operate as critical and engaged viewers. And it's something that I think sets this body of work, as it were, apart from, say, other kinds of contemporary artwork, right? And allows us to enter into these sort of historical dialogues also. So I wanted to think about that in the context of print, because obviously this is an exhibition that emerges out of a book and its printedness, that itself is influenced by other printed materials. And we have in the exhibition wonderful examples of print culture, as it were. And Marlena, I wanted to mention a phrase that kind of anchors your book, Tropics of Haiti, the transatlantic print culture of the Haitian Revolution, which I think is maybe a point where we can all, depart from, as it were, to think about what this print culture is and does. And so I thought, actually, if it was all right to maybe start thinking about this, Aaron, I wanted to prompt you to think about in the contact era, and to start, chronologically, as it were, with this sort of earlier historical moment, how printedness is something that is immensely influential in terms of these, the long history, as it were, of race, gender, power dynamics, and how that's operating. If you wanted to comment on that, just sort of in a general sense, in your research, how you've encountered printedness and how it has perhaps extended into the Haitian Revolution and into these later moments.
You mean printedness as in like documents, or?
Well, yeah, and I would welcome you to take that as a historian, I think, and that's why I wanted to have an interdisciplinary conversation, because I think there's a lot of ways in which we should think about this extending beyond just representation in a visual sense, right? But that these textual documents in this moment are circulating in ways that are really new, right? And in the 16th century, and that they set a precedent, as it were, right, for what's to come next. They establish certain conventions. And so I know that your work is really engaged with that in terms of indigeneity and the way in which it establishes certain conventions. So if you'd like to step into that prompt, and we can kind of go from there, we can take this in many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in the 16th century, we have very few documents written from the perspective of Indigenous peoples or African peoples. I will say, with the exception of Enrique, we actually have the only document written by a Taino Indian is his letter kind of surrender and agreeing to surrender to the Spanish and to accept their offer. He actually is able to create a free Indigenous community just outside of Santo Domingo. Unfortunately, it does not last long. And I think that this then kind of brings in many other issues of race and of sort of the formation of kind of lines, at least in colonial Spanish Caribbean, and that is that his Maroon community was multi-ethnic. It was indigenous Tainos. It was also Wolof slaves who had just arrived, and then other slaves joined him in the mountains. There's archaeological evidence that supports that, and in fact, the Spanish start calling the whole group Indios Negros, so the Black Indians that are there. But unfortunately, as part of his agreement with the King of Spain, he agrees to actually turn in African slaves as part to get kind of the pardon for he and his indigenous community. And about 10 years after it's founded, a group of African Maroon slaves attack the community and burn it down. And the remnants of it actually run to Santo Domingo. And it's from this point on, there's so much Spanish legislation that actually tries to enforce the divide between indigenous and African slaves. I think the first one is 1522, where they actually say, you know, we need to divide these people. We can't have, you know, an alliance built up, you know, against us with them. And so as far as texts, you know, we kind of have to read them. There's an anthropologist who describes this perfectly as we can gain the perspective of indigenous peoples and Africans only through a refraction of the Spanish documents. So the documents aren't reflecting reality, but they're kind of refracting it in a way. And so that's sort of how I see these early documents. But by the Haitian Revolution, I mean, there's ideas of liberty and pamphlets and everything. They're absolutely circulating in the Atlantic, from Cuba to Haiti to France and beyond.
Yeah, thank you. And that I think transitions into, Marlena, what you have written about and this notion of the tropics or the tropics, right? And the way in which the region is both framed in terms of a geopolitics, but there's also a kind of discursive level that's shaped representation so heavily in the region, and that emerges out of this moment of the Haitian Revolution. And I didn't know if you wanted to step into that bigger sort of conversation about how that's operating. And it's so, I think it lends so much depth to the way in which we can understand ourselves and position ourselves today relative to this visual sphere.
Yeah, I think so. My work on the intellectual history of Haiti right now is a lot about kind of the claims that we make about what is knowable and what's not knowable, and who gets kind of left out of that narrative, whose perspectives. And so that was one reason why I started with Erard Dumel from 1824, because the way that Haitians understood Macandal, Enrique, Bois Caïman, all of that is, to me, immensely of immense value, because often these stories were passed down. And so we'll get things like, oh, well, we don't really know about Macandal from the perspective of the enslaved Africans. But when we actually consult Haitian writing of the 19th century, Dumel was a child when the revolution began, but he got the story through his family members, who got the story through their family members. And so I find that there's this tension, because we want to say that all forms of knowing are equally of value, except that when we write about on the historical side of things, because I kind of straddle these two worlds, then we say that we don't have any written sources because they're, you know, we look at them differently. We go, oh, Erard Dumel was like writing poetry as well and narrating. So but that's exactly what Michel Gauve-Trouillot told us in Silencing the Past, the book that everyone cites. But it's like, we say that, but we don't believe it, that the poetry of Dumel, in which he inserts the only speech, the text of the speech that we have of Boukman for the Bois Caïman ceremony, that's where we have the text of the speech in a poem. And it's cited by historians all over, who kind of transform it into, it's a rhyming poem, but it's transformed in historiography. You can do a lot of violence with a footnote. And this is why I like intellectual history and literary history, because we need to hear what they said. We need to see what people said and the way that they said it and see that there's poetry in there, and that's how people understand their world, through dance, through music. We also understand our world that way, and yet somehow we sort of footnote away the spirit of exactly what's happening. And so when I also go into the colonial documents for Macandal, the officials are kind of like, oh, these Africans don't take this punishment seriously, they're laughing. But to me, in that laughing and mockery is like, you can kill our bodies, but you can't kill our souls. So like, you think the worst thing that can happen to an enslaved person is you're going to kill them, you know? And so in all of that, I find the merging of it together, that we can read against the grain and along the grain, and then we can add in other elements. And so that's one of the reasons I focus so heavily on print, but also a print that is really, as I mentioned, Macandal is also a dance, so we see it come up in that way. A print that is sort of like we have to understand it so much beyond just the written. We have to understand everything it's trying to invoke and do at the same time.
I wonder, Ana, if you want to jump in, because I know your scholarship is very much speaking to precisely those kinds of intellectual and cultural histories, but from a Cuban perspective, and thinking about what that layer then adds to this discourse.
I'm so impressed by all these interventions. And I was thinking about what Marlene was saying. So I'm going to say something about archives for a second, and then go back to what Erin was talking about in photography. So the challenge, whether you're a cultural historian or a literary person, that's where I stand, somewhere in the middle, or a historian, right? Everybody has, you know, and Ada Ferrer's book on Haiti, Freedom's Mirror, brings this to light, is that so-called absence, right? Which is in fact a resident archive, but it's often an embodied archive, right? It's an archive of storytelling, of genealogical knowledge, right? That's determined not to be historical knowledge, right? It's sense, in terms of the logic of sense, right? Instead of just sensibility or sensation, right? So I think that idea of the embodied archive of the human, the genealogies and generations which pass along, is something to think through. And I think that artists, right, plastic artists, visual artists, are working through that, right? I think when you encounter the materiality of the work, I was thinking of Jerry, like Jerry's work, Jerry talking about Shahrazad's work, and the kind of the layered, right, multimedia nature that kind of reflects the complication of a kind of history of images, right? So there's so much. I can't wait to go see this. I think, like, thank you, Florida, thank you, Pensacola. I just like, it's just remarkable. And then I was listening to Erin, whose work in history, you know, it must be all kinds of complication. And I'm a real admirer. I work on photography a little bit, and an admirer of Leah Gordon's work. And that central image of the triptych is from a William Blake illustration from 1796, right? Which Blake uses, he's an abolitionist, right? And he uses it as an allegory. There are all these, there's similar allegories, right? Some of them are statues of naked women, you know, indigenous or Black sustaining. The Theodore Roosevelt one is another one, right? That was outside the Museum of Natural History. And I really, like, I don't know what you all thought, but for me, the imperative of photography, like Gordon's use of photography to mess up your idea of an archive, right? Because she's also recreating an illustration of vagabondage, right? Of what it is to wander, right? In the other two. So I wonder, you know, I just wonder what people make of the materiality of the work, and of the idea of the archives of this work as archive. I don't mean to push it out of the art historical, but yeah, it's just remarkable. And I have to say, like, Eduard's work started it out, right? Seeing all that triptych. We haven't talked about Roberto Juarez's illustrations for the book, right? Which is the materiality of the book. But there's such richness here, and it's so great that the supplement of art is overtaking the original novel, right? It's kind of competing, right? I really love it. Yeah.
Thank you, Ana. Yeah, I want to take just a moment here and acknowledge Ana Dopico's immense efforts as one of the progenitors of this project, really. And so, you know, I neglected to mention that at first, but I think it's hugely important to acknowledge that you really had your approach to Carpentier and his work is, you know, really what extended this into the project that it is. So
it's your baby, Leslie. I think you need to claim this one. It's not me at all. Maybe we'll get it to New York.
Around.
Maybe we will get it to New York at some point.
I wanted just to kind of say a little bit about the idea of materiality, and even the idea of really pushing the boundaries of how we imagine even photography. So thinking of Gordon's work, photography, we imagine it to be, you know, to be real, to be representative, to tell us exactly what we see. And the fact that the work, she uses photography to really, to kind of create this composition, these different types of compositions, these different types of historical narratives, I think is really, such an astute way to actually use a medium that was created to actually tell us what is real. And I think the same thing in relationship to Garcia's painting, because, you know, we paint, again, what we see, we paint what we imagine. So to look at these images of painting, but also images of cutouts, and the ways in which she places the cutouts on the composition, and in some of the compositions, in two of the compositions, the figures are actually stepping out of the frame. So in a way, kind of coming into the space. So being able to be to manipulate, I think, the material is an additional aesthetic that is part of the conceptual. And I think that is something that we can see in a lot of different types of, a lot of artists of the Caribbean, artists of the African diaspora, because in that manipulation, in that kind of reimagining and restating is to go a little bit to Professor Dopico's conversation, is to manipulate the archives, is to manipulate what we imagine to be truth and what we imagine to be real. So I think this exhibition is exciting because it does that, and it does that in a very kind of capacious way, right? So we have artists who are dealing with so many different types of materials, so we're able to get this this kind of intervention into the archives in a variety of different ways, and gives us this capacious reading of Carpentier, but a capacious reading of the African diaspora and artists of the African diaspora. And that is what I found very generative when you sent me the slides a couple of months ago, Leslie, and I was like, yeah, I'm excited to be part of this. Thank you. Because it gave me the opportunity to think about the different ways in which these artists were actually dealing with history, and also challenging art historical narratives. You know, in many ways, challenging art historical narratives. And that's what I found really generative in the conversation, but also in the exhibition.
I want to jump in, Jerry, to say that yes, that is, for me, that is the absolute joy and pleasure of working on these artworks and working with these artists and working with scholars, is the way in which it just, it's difficult because it traverses so many kinds of labor, from archival. I mean, many of these artists, like Edouard is an artist who's done archival research, but then also disrupting that. And, you know, so in very literal, praxis-minded ways, there is a real interdisciplinarity that has pushed me, as a scholar and a thinker, and understanding how critical looking is activated, how it operates. You know, there's a very fundamental way in which these works are so challenging. I see that we are now at about 3:10 my time. So I think if it's all right, we have a number of questions, and perhaps we can address a couple of them. I know that Marlena has to jump off in just a moment So if I could just ask, there's a question that's directed specifically to you, and then we'll let you step off of the Zoom call. But the question is, oh, this is from you. I'm so sorry. Here, let me scroll back up here. Well, so let me pose this to everyone here. Thank you all for such an engaging analysis of the work and material. It was exciting to see these histories come to life through art and an academic lens. And so this is in terms of José Bedia's Voyons le Monde. There are many elements of spiritual sacrifice with the traditional animals of the goat and the rooster. And she was wondering about your thoughts specifically, Ana, on this. And I would open this up to everyone also in terms of the idea of martyrdom and what that means. And so I will start, I suppose, with Ana, and if anyone else wants to jump in.
So Bedia uses animals a lot, right? It's part of the cosmography of his work and the cosmography of syncretic African religions in the Caribbean, right? I'm going to push against the grain there and not read sacrifice because to his followers he doesn't die, right? He's not a sacrifice. And what's interesting in the painting is that the cross, the Christian cross, which is in the background, turns into a sort of peristyle itself, right? Beyond the peristyle that sort of distorts what the peristyle should do, right? So the reduction to sacrifice actually kind of nullifies what he has done, right? Which is turn death into liberation and liberated himself out of his form, right? So his embodiment changes just as revolution, right, changes into different forms. So yeah, but I mean, yeah, I mean, the way that Santería syncretic religions are fetishized or read in this kind of reductive way is to just, oh, it's about animal sacrifice. But in fact, in the case of Macandal, it's his transformation, right? And the transformation of death into life, right? Of enslavement into liberation. And that's what's so threatening and terrifying, right? Like to white authorities, right? And why the repression came for 500 years and, you know, and it's immediate. And the wars that followed. So yeah, so fascinating question, thanks.
And Marlena, do you want to jump in and before you have to leave us?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I don't read it in terms of martyrdom at all. And in fact, I love the words as recorded by the colonial authorities that Macandal's like, you're not going to actually kill me. I'm going to just transform myself into different living beings. And I always just sit with that. I mean, and so even though later it was mosquito and fly, yes, what Carpentier did in terms of the various kinds of life forms that Macandal became is exactly what he said. He didn't specify. He just said that, you know, and the time period. And I also look at what happened later, because during the ceremony at Bois-Caïman, Macandal was evoked, and later on during the revolution constantly. And even under Christophe and Dessalines, they would try to stop people from dancing the Macandal because they associated it with government protests against authority. And so even in the period afterwards, during Haitian independence, the idea was that when the Macandal happens, you know, this is something that's against authority. And since those were both very authoritarian rulers, they knew that it could sort of transform and bring something. But so that's just all to say that I don't think even 19th century Haitians read it as martyrdom. It was something so much more. It was, they were dancing it, they were singing it, it was so much more. It's also the name of the packet, the quote unquote magical packets. I mean, that's the language of the colonizers there, but the packets that they had, it was also the name of that. So it's really not a Christ-like figure, even though that's exactly what the amende honorable and breaking someone on the wheel is supposed to evoke. For the people who were there and the people who wrote about it afterwards, that wasn't what it was to them. So it's interesting, the idea of martyrdom that might be seeming to be evoked, but, you know, transformed by the understanding that people in the era and afterwards had of it.
It's fascinating and wonderful to hear through the specifics of the historical record too. There's a couple more questions. So for those who are able to hang around for another minute or two, I would be grateful if that's all right. We still have a number of attendees here with us, so go ahead and continue onward if that's okay. This question is, well, she says, thanks so much for the very thought-provoking talks. And Ana, I was really fascinated by your discussion of the displacement of the Haitian Revolution. Oh, Marlena, thank you so much. And thank you. So appreciate you. So this question is about your term of displacement of the Haitian Revolution, as well as the consumption of Haiti and Caribbean Blackness by intellectuals, ethnographers, and artists. So looping in the work of the other panelists, this question is wondering how you all see this consumption as well as opacity articulated in the work of contemporary artists, but from the contemporary artists from the Caribbean, like Edouard, Jose, and Sherazade, but also in the general exclusion and marginalization of Haitian indigenous painting here, AKA popular, quote unquote, art. So bringing in, which is a great way to extend this conversation into thinking about the ways in which we think through these broader categories and how Haitian painting generally is conceived today. So I'll open that up.
Was that to a particular person or just?
No, this is for all the panelists,
Oh.
for anyone who'd like to jump in.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think for one of the concerns, not concerns, one of the issues that I have is the very problematic way in which I think Haitian art gets lumped into just Haitian art. So there is no particular kind of delineation and no particular kind of understanding of what we can imagine to be traditional art, what can we imagine to be modern art, what can we imagine to be contemporary art. So like Ana was saying in the earlier presentation, there's a way in which Haiti kind of comes to stand in for so many different things, and its art history, its art tradition, art is not given the same kind of nuances and ways in which European art is given, or even American art for that matter. So I think that one of the concerns, or one of the concerns that I have, is really pushing against this idea of just lumping everything as Haitian art. There are definitely different types of ways to understand that, and there is the traditional art by self-taught artists or artisans or individuals who are working with different types of materials, is as equally important and necessary to have a conversation as someone who is academically trained, let's say like Edouard or other individuals. The challenging thing, I think, is also to for us to actually think about how many of these artists, even the ones who are on the island and are themselves self-taught, are influenced by so many different contemporary issues and contemporary ideas, and they themselves are aware of contemporary issues, contemporary ideas, and different ways of art making. And that oftentimes gets kind of lost in the conversation, wanting to continue to imagine them as part of the 1944, Centre d'Art, so, painting with DeWitt Peters and so forth, and not really having any kind of understanding of themselves as artists. And I think, so I think the first thing is to really think about that there is not necessarily a need for comparison, but it's basically a need to show the kind of breadth of the work that's being done by artists of Haitian descent. So I don't know if that helps or answers the question, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there for us to really think largely about, also to really think about terms that we're using to really make conversations about particular artistic moments and movements.
Thank you so much. I think that perhaps that's an ideal place to kind of wrap up our conversation, and thinking about these terminologies and thinking about all of the mischaracterizations, as it were, and the ways in which we should really bring a critical eye to all of these discourses. And I think that all of the artwork in this exhibition that you all have so brilliantly expanded on and expounded on has helped us to understand that better. So I want to thank you all so much for your time and your expertise, and thank you to everyone in attendance. This has been recorded, and the Pensacola Museum of Art is going to make it available, so we'll share that once that's ready, I suppose. And I thank you all and wish you a happy, healthy weekend.